Wine, a young woman of 21, stood at the entrance of the grand mansion. Her heart pounding in her chest, she gazed up at the enormous structure, a blend of old world charm and modern luxury. This was the Kim estate, owned by Taehyung, a notorious gangster known for his ruthlessness and power. She had never imagined working here, but circumstances had forced her hand. Her family was struggling financially, and this job as a maid promised good pay. As Wine entered the mansion, she was greeted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Choi, a woman in her late 50s with a stern face but kind eyes. Welcome, Wine. Let me show you to your quarters, Mrs. Choi said, leading her through the opulent hallways. You will start work tomorrow. Mr. Kim values discretion above all else. Keep your head down and do your job, and you will do just fine. Wine nodded, taking in every detail. The mansion was a labyrinth of secrets, with rooms that seemed to whisper of past events. She wondered about Teung, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones. He was 27, but stories of his rise to power made him seem much older. As they passed a large door, Wine couldn't help but ask, does Mr. Kim live alone? Mrs. Choi paused for a moment before answering. Yes, apart from his occasional guests, there was a hint of something in her tone that one couldn't quite place. Perhaps a mix of fear and respect. Wine's first day of work was uneventful, filled with cleaning and organizing. She didn't see Taeyong at all, but the staff spoke of him in fearful tones. Rumor had it that he had a violent temper and was not someone to cross. That night, Wine lay in her small room in the servants' quarters, staring at the ceiling. She was just drifting off when she heard footsteps approaching her door. Before she could react, the door opened and Theung stepped inside. He was tall with a commanding presence. His dark eyes bored into hers as he stood there, his face unreadable. Wine sat up quickly, heart racing. Mr. Kim, is there something you need? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Tim didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked closer, his movements slow and deliberate. I need to make sure you understand the rules of this house. He finally said, his voice cold. You do what I say. When I say it, no questions, no hesitation. Why nodded, swallowing hard. Yes, Mr. Kim, I understand. He reached out his hand, brushing against her cheek in a way that sent a shiver down her spine. Good, because if you don't, his voice trailed off, leaving that threat hanging in the air. Then, without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving Wine shaken and confused. Over the next few days, Wine settled into her routine, but the tension in the house was palpable. Tyung was often away handling his business, but when he was home, his presence was a storm cloud hovering over everyone. One night, Wine was finishing up her chores when she heard muffled voices coming from Tyung's study room. She paused outside the door, listening. I told you to take care of it. Ting's voice was low but filled with menace. I don't want any loose ends. A second voice responded, but Wine couldn't make out the words. She quickly moved away from the door, her mind racing. What was he involved in? Her curiosity was dangerous, but she couldn't help herself. She needed to know more. Later that night, she was awoken by the sound of her door opening again. This time, Theung didn't say anything as he entered. He simply walked over to her bed, his eyes never leaving hers. Wine's breath catch in her throat as he sat down beside her, his hand sliding up her arm. Wine, he whispered, his voice softer now but no less commanding. I'm going to teach you what happens to those who defy me. Wine knew she could be afraid, but there was something else there too, a dangerous allure in his voice. A pull she couldn't resist, she noted, her body tense. He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. The kiss was rough, demanding, but it sent a jolt of electricity through her. She found herself responding, her hands moving up to his shoulders as if on their own accord. Taehyung's grip tightened, pulling her closer. As the days passed, the dynamic between Taehyung and Wine became more complicated. He was a mystery she was desperate to solve, and each night he came to her, his touch leaving her both terrified and longing for more. One evening, as they sat in his study room, Taehyung finally opened up about his past. I didn't choose this life, he sat staring into the fire. It was forced upon me after my parents were killed. I had to survive, and the only way to do that was to become the man you see now. While listened, her heart itching for him despite everything. I'm sorry, she whispered. I can't imagine what that must have been like. Tyung turned to her, his eyes softening for the first time. Don't pity me when I don't deserve it. I have done things, terrible things, and I will do them again if I have to. Despite his words, one reached out, touching his hand. You're not a monster, Tyung. You are just lost. He looked at her, a mix of emotions crossing his face. Maybe, but you shouldn't get too close in a web of danger and desire that you couldn't escape. And as Tiang pulled her into another heated kiss, she knew that there was no turning back. The tension in the mansion grew thicker with each passing day. Wine couldn't sense it in the way the staff whispered in the halls and avoided eye contact with Tiang. He was becoming more unpredictable, his mood swinging from cold detachment to intense possessiveness. Wine was both frightened and captivated by him, and the strange relationship they shared continued to pull her deeper into a world she didn't fully understand. One afternoon, while dusting the library, Wine stumbled upon a locked drawer in Ting's desk. Her heart raced with curiosity. She knew she shouldn't, but the lure of Ting's secrets was too strong. She hesitated, glancing around to make sure she was alone. Taking a deep breath, she used a bobby pin from her hair to pick the lock, a skill she had learned in her youth. Out of necessity, flipped through the notebook, her eyes widening as she realized it was filled with names, dates, and amounts of money. She didn't understand what it all meant, but it was clearly important. Something illegal, judging by the encrypted codes and symbols. Before she could read further, she heard footsteps approaching. Panic surged through her as she quickly shut the drawer and locked it again. Just in time, Theung entered the room, his gaze immediately zeroing in on her. What are you doing in here? He demanded, his voice sharp. One's mind raced for an excuse, just cleaning, sir. She stammered, trying to keep her face neutral. Ting's eyes narrowed, but he didn't press further. Finish up and leave, he ordered, turning away to pour himself a drink. Relieved, Wine hurried out of the room, but her heart was still pounding. She knew she had just crossed a dangerous line. That night, Tyung didn't come to her room. Wine lay awake, wondering if he suspected her, if he knew she had been snooping. She replayed the scene in her mind, the way his eyes had darkened when he looked at her. What would he do if he found out? Unable to sleep, Wine decided to take a walk through the mansion to clean her head. The house was early silent, and she tiptoed down the hallways, careful not to make a sound. As she passed by the kitchen, she heard voices low and urgent. She recognized one of them as Theung's curiosity got the better of her again, and she moved closer, hiding behind the doorframe to listen. We have a problem, Theung was saying. The shipment was intercepted and now we're short. What do you want us to do, boss? A male voice asked. Find out who's behind it and deal with them. I don't care how. Wine's blood ran cold. She knew she shouldn't be listening, but she couldn't help it. The conversation continued with Taehyung giving orders, that sent chills down her spine. He was ruthless, calculating, and completely in control. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Wine gasped and turned around, coming face to face with Mrs. Choi. The older woman's expression was stern but not unkind. Come with me. Mrs. Choi whispered, pulling her away from the kitchen. Once they were in a quiet hallway, she let go of Wine's arm. You shouldn't be here. It's dangerous to eavesdrop. Wine nodded, her heart still racing. I'm sorry, I wanted to know what was going on. Mrs. Choi sighed, her expression softening. I understand, but Taehyung is not someone you want to cross. He has his reasons for being the way he is, but that doesn't mean he's safe. Why do you stay? Wine asked, genuinely curious. Mrs. Choi hesitated before answering. Loyalty, and because I believe there is still good in him, somewhere deep down, but you were too young to get involved in all this. You should leave while you can. Wine thought about Mrs. Choi's words, keep longing after they parted. She knew she should leave, but something kept her there, something about Taeyong that she shouldn't let go of, no matter how dangerous he was. The next few days passed in a blur and tension and uncertainty. Wine avoided Taeyong as much as possible, but it was impossible to avoid him completely. One evening, she found herself in the kitchen preparing tea. When Taeyong walked in, he looked different, tired, almost vulnerable. It was a side of him she had not seen before. He leaned against the counter, watching her as she worked. Wine, he sat quietly, and she turned to face him, her heart thudding in her chest. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had not ended up here? She hesitated, unsure of how to respond. Sometimes, she admitted, but I try not to dwell on it. What's the point? Taeyong nodded as if her answer made sense to him. Do you hate me? He asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. The question took her by surprise. I don't know. She said honestly, you scare me, but I don't think I hate you. He moved closer, and Vine felt that familiar pull, the magnetic force that drew her to him despite everything. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. I don't want you to be afraid of me, he said softly. Vine's breath catch in her throat, then stop giving me reasons to be afraid, she whispered back. For a moment, neither of them moved, then, as if compelled by some unseen force, Theung leaned in, capturing her lips in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. Wine responded without thinking, her arms wrapping around his neck as she pressed herself against him. The kiss deepened, and Theung's hand moved to her waist, pulling her closer. Wine felt a rush of emotions, fear, desire, confusion, all blending together in a way that made her head spin. She knew she should pull away, but she could not. Not when his touch sent fire through her veins. Just as suddenly as it began, Theung broke the kiss, pulling back as if he had been burned. His expression was conflicted, a mixture of longing and regret. I'm sorry, he muttered, stepping away from her. I should not have. Vansh shook her head, trying to catch her breath. It's okay, she said, even though she was not sure. He gave her a sad smile. You don't need to understand me. Why just stay safe? Stay away from the darkness that surrounds me. But I knew it was too late for that. She was already too far gone, lost in the shadows of his world, and there was no turning back. The days following the kiss were filled with a tense silence. Thing avoided Vine, and she found herself longing for his presence. Despite the fear he instilled in her, her thoughts were a jumble of confusion and curiosity. She knew she was playing with fire, but something about Taehyung's haunted eyes and troubled past drew her in. Late one evening, Wine found herself standing outside his study again. She hesitated, debating whether to knock or walk away. Before she could decide, the door opened and there stood Taehyung, a dark expression on his face. Why are you here? He asked, his voice cold. I want you to talk. Wine said, her voice barely audible. Taehyung stepped aside, allowing her to enter. She walked in, her nerves fraying with every step. The room felt colder than usual, and Taehyung's presence was like a storm brewing in the distance. What do you want to talk about? He asked, his tone clipped. Wine took a deep breath, gathering her courage. I want to understand you, Taehyung. I want to know why you are the way you are. He let out a bitter laugh. You think knowing my story will change anything? It won't. You should leave Wine before it's too late. Wine shook her head. I can't just walk away from you. Taehyung's eyes darkened and he moved closer, his expression intense. You don't know what you are asking for. Wine, my world is not a place for someone like you. I am already a part of it, she replied softly. Whether you want me to be or not, he stared at her for a long moment, his gaze searching hers, and with a low growl he pulled her into his arms, his lips crushing against hers in a fierce, demanding kiss. This time there was no hesitation, no second thoughts. One responded with equal passion, her hands tangling in his hair as she gave herself over to the moment. The kiss deepened, becoming more heated, more desperate. Duke's hands roamed her body, igniting a fire within her that she couldn't control. Y knew she was crossing a line, but she didn't care. She was lost in him, in the danger and the thrill of